It's Monday, and that's what happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Now, if you are about my age and you turned on the TV later than you probably should have on a school night, you likely got scared out of your wits by the opening of this show that seems to start off peacefully in a park or picnic area, but then gets dark as the narrator speaks these words. Man lives in the sunlit world of what he believes to be reality. But there is, unseen by most, an underworld, a place that is just as real, but not as brightly lit. A Darkside. That's the opening narration of Tales from the Darkside, and it used to scare me quite a bit as a 7 or 8 or 9-year-old. This was the brainchild of horror master George A. Romero. Now we're going to take a look at the pilot episode this week with the episode called Trick or Treat, which originally aired on October 29th, 1983. Perfect timing for something like this to air. In 1982, Romero and Stephen King made the anthology film Creepshow that is, if I may be so bold, one of the more important horror films of that decade. It was a love letter to horror comics of the 50s that I'm positive both Romero and King read. Now, this was Romero at his very best. It was post-Martin Dawn of the Dead and Creepshow, and he was building up towards Day of the Dead and Monkey Shines, the latter I've covered here on Monster Mondays. What's pretty great about Tales from the Darkside is that, despite the scary narration, many of these episodes had a bunch of that George A. Romero personality. Many episodes had a little comedy sprinkled in. Yes, there were scary monsters to be sure, but sometimes there were episodes with funny little twists or goofy down on their luck losers that take, a little bit of the bite out of the scary. Now, there are some specifically scary episodes that I will get to in time with this series, but Romero still kept with the anthology elements that made Creepshow so good. He employed big-time authors who often adapted their own works, like Harlan Ellison, Robert Bloch, and Clive Barker. A couple episodes were made as adaptations of Stephen King short stories, with one, Sorry Right Number, from his Nightmares and Dreamscapes short story collection, that King wrote the teleplay for himself. And that episode aired in 1987 during the final season of Tales from the Darkside. Now, of course, Romero also wrote episodes as well, including this pilot. There also is an interesting director for this episode, Bob Balaban. Balaban is better known as an actor in movies like Catch-22, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Altered States, and 2010, The Year We Make Contact, where he played Dr. Chandra, the guy who programmed HAL 9000, the creepy computer from the previous film, 2001, A Space Odyssey. Now, in 1990, after the series ended, a movie, Tales from the Darkside, the movie, came out. A lot of people think that this is more or less the true Creepshow 3, and the movie featured some memorable stories as well as some recognizable names like Debbie Harry, Steve Buscemi, Christian Slater, Julianne Moore, David Johansen, and William Hickey. I'll always remember that movie as being one that one of my brothers took me to shortly after our second run Dollar Theater opened on our side of town in 1990. But let's get into the pilot for the series, Tales from the Darkside. Now, the episode opens with two accountants meeting with an old store owner to balance the books in the middle of the night. They mentioned that it's like 3 a.m, and they had to drive all the way out there from Philadelphia. The store owner, Mr. Hackles, is miserly. He doesn't want to hire anyone to help him with his store. He doesn't trust them. When the accountants ask for a cup of coffee, he charges them each 4 cents, as he's calculated the exact cost of that coffee and added 10% or 20%, to profit from it. He doesn't even trust banks to keep his money safe. He's also a bit of a trickster who loves Halloween. He's rigged up a spooky monster to fly out from the back room to scare the crap out of the accountants. Now, Hackles has so much power over the rural town that he operates out of because he holds a considerable amount of IOUs from members of the town. Just about everyone is in debt to Hackles. He does a tradition each Halloween. He takes everyone's IOUs and invites the children to come and seek out the slips of paper that these are written out on that are hidden throughout Hackles' house. If the children can find them, he forgives that family's debt totally. One kid we see early on wants to participate, but his father doesn't allow him to. He thinks that Hackles kind of messes with the kids to almost abusive levels. Now, as the children arrive at the Hackles house to trick or treat, or in other words, seek out their family's IOUs, Hackles taunts and beckons the children through an old speaker system, while the various rigs of monsters and other scary things jump out and scare the children away. If they leave, they are disqualified. Now, one girl barely spends 30 seconds in the house before she's scared and runs away. One little boy tries to remain strong for his desperate father, but that only invites Hackles to increase the intensity of the various tricks rigged up around the house. When the little boy runs out of the house and ultimately disappoints his father, Hackles sees the father forgive his frightened son, and the old man repeats a typical refrain of his that the people in this town have it all backwards. As he begins to set things back up for the next trick-or-treater, Hackles starts to notice that things are a bit off with the various tools of his haunted house, and the next visitor comes to the door and sees an old witch who then floats into his house and cackles at the old man Hackles. She even uses magic to reveal the IOUs in the chimney and starts blowing and then even throwing them around the room. She does the same thing with his money as well. And while trying to hold on to his money and his IOUs that are flying around the room, the only thing he cares about, Hackles is then confronted by the literal devil, who taunts Hackles like the old man does children. Hackles is then taken to hell by the devil and some of his demons. Later, that boy who wanted to participate earlier but was denied by his father sneaks over to Hackles' place and is met by the witch at the front door, who not only relinquishes all of the IOUs to the boy, but also gives him much of the old man's valuables and money. The little boy walks back home and passes by a gravestone that reads, "Here lies Gideon Hackles, businessman. He took it all with him." Now, alright, I know that this is a little shorter than the typical episode, but sometimes your dear host needs a break from time to time. But before we put the wraps on this, let's talk about the 3 things that I like about this episode of Tales from the Darkside. And I'm going to be fair. I'm going to kind of wrap this whole thing up into one big like that has 3 elements that kind of encompasses the entire joy that I kind of felt rewatching this episode. First and foremost, I absolutely love the atmosphere of this episode. It's something about horror that kind of happens in like a nebulous past that always kind of intrigues me. Around the same time this show was coming along, I had probably just seen the movie Something Wicked This Way Comes, which I covered last year on this show. That also took place in what I would have to imagine to be roughly the Depression era, maybe just after World War II. It's definitely not the present, and neither is this episode's setting. It's rural, yes, but it also has none of the markings of modernity that you might come to expect from something that you're watching in the present day, or at least at that time in the 80s. So it has all this very earthy and very homemade feel to the kids' costumes and the various traps and the tricks set up by Hackles. You don't often see this in horror, but I do always find myself kind of drawn to this idea. Think about it. Something like what's going on here with simple folk scared of obvious tricks or supernatural stuff, and a miserly old jerk who basically owns the town through debt, makes it easy to kind of have these characters be instilled with this fear and desperation. And in a way, this is all about how desperate people became during these trying times. And looking at it from a more modern time, even if this came out 40 years ago now, farmers in rural communities have been in trouble for a really long time. So I guess what I'm getting at is that this despair and these superstitious feelings that these generally simple kids have just kind of sets this wonderful Halloween tone and atmosphere. Then, second, to kind of couple that with, with this one, imagine being kind of a young kid and it's just before Halloween and this is on TV tonight. It would have gotten me right in the mood for trick-or-treating, and it would have gotten me in the mood for walking around on a cold fall night when everything is dying around you and it's just naturally spooky. These are the types of things I love about spooky movies and TV shows. I don't really care so much about gore. I don't really care so much about jump scares. I like the atmosphere, and it's actually perfect that this was a Halloween story to set the stage for the series, and it got the opportunity to air just before Halloween, and that's just great. Now, lastly, there's more than just a mean old man and kids in Halloween costumes getting spooked by the old man's quote-unquote haunted house. I mentioned that there's despair in this town. The truly chilling and scary thing in this episode isn't the old man or his contraptions, it's debt. Imagine if all you have is a farm that is like so many others. With there being so many other farms across much of the United States, there could be a lot of things that could go very, very wrong. A drought, economic issues that prevent people from buying fresh or high quality or even enough food. Considering this seems to be set in the past and maybe even during the Depression, this is a town that is completely broke. No one can afford to pay for anything with cash, so they have to give this old miser power over them by way of debt. Now, see how parents kind of pass this despair and desperation down to their kids. The old miser is technically abusing these kids, but not really directly. He's making their parents desperate for their kids to find these IOUs and absolve them from the debt that they are constantly paying. And oh yeah, I should mention that the debt is compounding because they had to go into debt with Hackles, and then they have to pay him back. And when they do pay him back, they don't have hardly anything. So they have to take out more debt to end up surviving. It's pretty dire. So the one dad who you think is so desperate to get out of debt, he sees his son fail in getting the IOUs, and you think that he's going to take it out on the kid. But something else happens. The father has a split-second moment to do some self-reflection, and he doesn't punish his kid for failing him. He comforts his terrified son. It's a really great piece of writing by Romero, and it's well acted and directed too. It shows that the humanity of this town still exists, even if Hackles has none of his own. The debt may come and go or get worse, but you can't ever go into emotional debt with your kid. It's bad enough that they force their children to do this out of their own desperation. They cannot take it out on them when it doesn't work out. While I always wish that some of these Tales from the Darkside episodes were an hour long because things shift so very quickly, like with Hackle suddenly getting supernatural retribution brought down on him, it's still a great little half hour of TV, and it's no wonder that this show could easily be packaged and sold to stations through syndication. In a few weeks, we'll come back and check out a couple of more episodes. And I might do some episodes of Monster Mondays with 2 Tales from the Darkside episodes, maybe some with 3 if I need a break. I might just do one at a time like I am here. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at FilmSeizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next time, I'm going to close the books on the Daimajin trilogy with the 3rd installment, Daimajin Strikes Again. And you know what? I've grown accustomed to closing out each episode by advising you to stay spooky. How about I close this episode as narrator Paul Sparer did for each episode of Tales from the Darkside? The dark side is always there, waiting for us to enter waiting to enter us. Until next time, try to enjoy the daylight.